All right. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're tuning in, and welcome to another Valid Thoughts webinar brought to you by ValidMind. I'm Kevin Allen, Director of Product Marketing for ValidMind, and I'm so excited to welcome you to today's webinar with my colleague, Kristof Horompoly. Now, today's topic could not be more relevant, the impact of generative AI in model risk management. So we're so fortunate to have someone today who has deep expertise in this topic. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Kristof Horompoly, VP of AI Risk Management for ValidMind. Kristof?
Thank you so much, Kevin, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone joining in. We'll try to make this an exciting session. I'll try to keep it rather short to about 30 minutes, and then at the end, if you have any questions, please feel free to chime in. So just to give a bit of an intro to this topic, I'm sure most on this call are aware of some trends that are happening here in AI, and in the last year and a half to 2 years, we've really been seeing a big shift in the types of AI that we're using and how we're using that AI, and really this regime change from traditional classical AI to generative AI, and thinking about how to use this technology in a responsible way and how to properly govern it has really been top of mind for a lot of organizations. And this is a topic that I'll be talking about, but just as a caveat, I don't know the answer to these questions. I'm just going to try to point out a few things that I've seen in practice, and a few pointers that organizations should be aware of and should be thinking about as they accelerate their journey into deploying and using Gen AI safely for their organizations. So maybe we can jump to the first slide. Awesome. So the first thing I wanna talk about a little bit is what's the big deal? How is Gen AI different, and is it really different? And what are the implications of these differences for your organization? So the first thing I want to talk about in terms of the differences here are the underlying data for training the model. So in classical machine learning, you would usually have a specific task that you wanted to solve with your machine learning solution. You would collect the data that was most relevant to that task, and you would train your machine learning system or algorithm. Now you are dealing with generative AI and in particular often large language models in financial services, where the underlying training data is incredibly large. Basically, the more the better, right? As long as there's a certain level of quality is maintained, you're looking for a lot of data in a lot of areas, because the Gen AI needs to be doing so many different things at the same time. So you could say that in classical AI, you were dealing with small data, and we often didn't feel that way because it was still a lot of data. But now the magnitude of data that goes into the training set is much, much larger. This ties in very much with the use. So how are these models applicable? And again, in classical AI, you really had these niche uses. So you might have a model for fraud detection, or a model for marketing, or a model for credit lending, and that's the only thing that the model was capable of doing. It was very easy to define the scope of the model. With Gen AI, we don't have that. So Gen AI, you could say, it's kind of a prototype for AGI in many ways. Of course, we're not there yet, but in terms of capabilities, it really covers the whole spectrum. Now, because it is so powerful and so large, it's really going to be just a few select institutions that can truly compete in this space because of the resources that they have. And so this is another thing that we're of course seeing, that you have a handful of major players in this space that are training these models and making them available to the public. But this means that most institutions will need to deal with the fact that these models are going to be coming from the outside. They're external, and that has a lot of implications for your governance. And most importantly, of course, if it's not an open source model or an open access model, you're not going to have any insight into what the actual data was that was used to train, and what the architecture and the parameters are. So you're going to have to work with an even greater black box than you're used to with neural networks, in addition to the added complexity of these models. And this means that you have to somehow contain the or scope the risk as you apply the Gen AI. And this is what I mean when I say you have to focus on the use case, because ultimately your implementation will be an internal implementation of a use case of the Gen AI. So you're going to be looking at two components. One of them is the foundational model itself, which was most likely externally developed, and you're bringing in through an API or whatever means you are. And then you're going to be building your internal application or your internal use case around that. Testing the foundational model on your end is incredibly difficult. There are, of course, ways that you can potentially set up some testing, but it becomes a lot more important to focus your efforts on the actual use case. So you're almost like narrowing down the scope of the Gen AI into something tangible, something that you can put a parameter around and scope in a way that you can manage the risk. And then finally, the other one that I wanted to mention, and this is maybe more specific, but I find it interesting what's going on in the explainability space right now. You really had an expectation of some level of explainability with classical AI. And even when you were dealing with complex neural networks or really more sophisticated models, you generally were able to create some sort of proxy model for understanding at least the top features that go into the decision making, and had some idea of what the decisioning was about. With Gen AI, we really don't have any good options for that right now. And it's also interesting how our attitudes are shifting, at least from what I'm seeing. There's a lot less talk about explainability, right? We've recognized that it's a problem. We don't currently have a solution for it. So we're kind of okay with that. And this is probably the direction that we're going to have to go, because we all want to leverage the power of this technology, but it is at the expense of having that transparency and explainability of the models. So we'll probably have to shift to using empirical data and evidence to confirm the accuracy of these models, and they are getting more and more accurate and robust. And that will help us to verify that they are functioning as we expect them to function, without knowing exactly how the decisioning happens. And it's not just a limitation of these models being proprietary. It's really the complexity. We are getting to the point where these models are just so big and so complex that it's difficult to simplify it down to a point where we as humans understand what is really going on. So I think we can jump to the next slide here. And then here's the $1 million question. Now, all of these differences, and by the way, this is not an exhaustive list of differences. I really just wanted to point out a few things that can really affect how we think about governance for AI. And now I'll focus in on some of the areas that where I feel like the governance aspect changes significantly. So of course we still have to think about the inventory. Instead of having a single inventory item as we did for our classical AI, we might have a foundational model and then an associate use case. But all of these are just minor details. But one of the big ones is, again, how do we deal with data, right? So we don't really have any oversight over the data that was used to train it. So the data that we can control is what is the data that we feed into the model. And again, with some of these use cases, that could be anything, right? It's no longer limited to numbers. It's no longer limited to tabular data. We can often prompt anything that we want with these. And we have to think through what sort of data we want to allow, both for security reasons as well as privacy, confidentiality. All of these things come into play when we think about what is the data we input into these, and also how do we retain that trail of interaction with the system. Do we want to keep all of the users' prompts and save them? Do we not want to do that, and why? I mean, there are of course legal implications around all of these. In the actual development, of course, you're going to be doing experimentation, you're going to be testing, so you're going to be doing different types of tests and different types of benchmarks. But ultimately, that's part of any development process. But then when you actually have your use case implemented and want to move it into production, there will need to be a number of steps that you go through to receive that green light or that approval, or depending on your institution, how they go through this process. And this is I think where there's going to be a major shift in terms of the focus of who is really involved in this process. Traditionally at financial institutions, you had model risk as the second line team for reviewing any sort of quantitative model and then approving it, and that was really the big gate to get it into production. Now, if we think about what the role of model risk was and how they ultimately operate, they look at the quantitative aspects of the model. So they want to see what is the type of data that goes into the model. They want to see is the model conceptually sound? What is the architecture? Why did they come up with that architecture? They want to know about the decision making. How was that decision made? What are the top features? So explainability. Now, these are some really core questions that model risk generally asks when they're trying to get through the approval. They really don't have access to any of this information when it comes to a model from OpenAI or from Google. So they can, of course, review the use case. They can look at the internal implementation, but we need to bring in other stakeholders into this review process. And so what you might start to see at organizations is really having a legal team involved, or having compliance teams involved and controls teams involved. All of these teams will likely take a look, especially at more sensitive use cases, and we'll talk a little bit more about what constitutes sensitive. But ultimately, you're going to be looking at it in terms of legal implications of using something, looking at how users are interacting and how they need to comply with certain codes of conduct internally when they're using this tool, and all of these things. So you start to see these other stakeholders come into the review process, which of course makes it lengthier, and a bit more cumbersome initially to roll these out. But over time, I believe we're going to streamline these processes also and see really how we need to how and who we need to bring into this process. And then I think another really big one as we're thinking about rolling out some Gen AI solutions is the type of content and education that we provide to the end user. Again, historically with these very quantitative models, you often had quite quantitative users and subject matter experts who were interacting with the model, and really no one else. Now, a lot of the Gen AI applications will have a broad range of users and could have bigger parts of the organization, often less quantitative employees who may not have an understanding of how these models work. And education and the proper disclosures become really, really important. And even trying to provide a little bit of context of where some of the risks are arising from due to how this works. And really, the obvious ones are thinking about hallucinations and toxicity, but really making sure that there's no over-reliance on these solutions at this point. Because as we all know, ChatGPT can give us some really, really convincing and cool answers that have absolutely nothing to do with reality. And if people start to see these models perform well on a day-to-day basis, they may stop to think and look to make sure that the answers are in fact valid, are in fact complete. And so having that, making sure that at this stage of the game, you have that human in the loop, ideally an expert in the loop. But if you can't have the expert in the loop, then educating your end user on what the issues could be and how they can potentially mitigate them. And then going off of that is the an ability for your users to provide quick feedback, right? The best way to test the performance of these ultimately is to have people to use it. And the more people that are using it and the more people that are providing feedback, the more you can iterate on your solution and make it reliable and robust. And so, there are all these different options of like the thumbs up, thumbs down votes on answers. And these are really quick that your users will be happy to do, especially if they see something wrong. And that's ultimately when you want the feedback. You want the feedback when you see something that is a hallucination, completely incorrect, or the answer is incomplete or vague. If there's something toxic coming through, if you see private information filtering through, of course, all of these are problems that you want to mitigate, and you want that feedback immediately from your users. So I mentioned I'll talk a little bit about what it means for a use case to be sensitive and how you can potentially approach this question. And model risk frameworks in financial institutions have these complex risk assessment frameworks for their traditional AI and statistical models and financial models. Here again, we need to think a little bit differently. Again, the dimensions are similar, but they still can manifest in different ways. And so one of the first obvious ones that we have to think, and perhaps this is the most important question, is our solution client facing? Meaning, do our customers directly interact with our Gen AI solution? And we've seen some examples in the news, like Air Canada, various chatbots that are promising discounts and $1 cars and all of these things. Fairly harmless examples, but of course the the point is that you have no control. You have no control point between your customer and your solution. And so the customer, you cannot control what the customer is putting into that prompt. You cannot control how that customer is trying to break the prompt, right? When you're dealing with your employees, you can educate them, and you can basically put guardrails around what they should and should not do. With your customer, you don't have that. And so if they're able to sort of say jailbreak your solution, or provoke it to say something that's inappropriate, you might be on the headlines. Even if the solution is not high risk in the traditional sense, maybe it's just a very harmless chatbot about the weather or whatever. It can still lead to headlines because you have no control over the interaction between your client and the tool. In financial services, of course, the big question is always, is this something that the regulators need? If it's a solution that in any way affects a regulatory submission or an area of the organization that is highly regulated, whether it's something like credit lending or anti-money laundering, you have to be extra careful, right? That's usually where you need a lot more explainability, a lot more transparency into your solution, and having large language models or other sorts of Gen AI integrated into that solution is quite risky. There may be ways to do it in a limited fashion, but again, you need to be very mindful of how you justify using Gen AI at this point. The next one is somewhat related to the first question, which is, is there a human, ideally an expert, in the loop at all, right? Is the decisioning completely automated and it just flows through the system, and an LLM is making these decisions at some point without any sort of oversight? That, of course, raises the risk. So you just have to think about which use cases would you be okay with something going wrong and you not really realizing in time. And again, there may be situations where operationally you gain a lot of efficiency, and if something goes wrong, then nothing really bad happens, in which case you could do a fully automated decisioning with this, but you just have to be very careful, again, thinking through where you would use this. And then finally, again, this is then a bit more related to the regulatory implication, which is what are the ultimate implications of the decisioning of the tool? And by this I mean, what is it used for, right? So could it affect the safety of somebody? Could it affect the livelihood of somebody? Could it affect any sort of fundamental human rights? And if we're talking about lending, for example, or if we're talking about any sort of autonomous vehicle or something, if you start to bring in Gen AI into that, which affects how these systems operate, it is of course much higher risk. And this is also the case in classical AI, of course. But this is a question that we just ultimately always have to ask, because that gets to the core of the sensitivity and the risk of the use case. So I think we can jump to the last slide. So now we've really been talking to a lot of people across the industry to get a sense of where they are with the maturity of their Gen AI solutions and how they think about this going forward. And really, we started having, or you start to hear about these things over a year ago, and people were very hesitant to talk about it. But of course, after ChatGPT came out in November 2022, everybody started to immediately think about the potential opportunities that this could bring, and how they could safely incorporate it into their organizations. Now, of course, financial services is highly regulated, and so everybody was a little afraid of jumping the gun on this. And you did see a few organizations come out with tools pretty early. I think Morgan Stanley had a portfolio advisor tool that they were pretty open about from the beginning. But in general, there was incredible reluctance to talk about anything going to production, even just 6 to 12 months ago. We really weren't talking about that, and everybody was like, well, we're in ideation mode, we're in experimentation mode, we're thinking about where we could use it. And then some firms just said, no, absolutely not. For now, we're not dealing with this. Now, fast forward to now, and really, it's incredible how much it has shifted. There's an expectation that everybody is working on this, right? There's a and also, if you're bringing a solution to the customer will likely ask, what sort of Gen AI solutions do you have incorporated? So there is an expectation for people to be moving forward with this. And of course, the only way you can move forward with this is to first establish a robust governance framework around this. And that's really where everybody's trying to figure out what is that framework. And what we're expected to see is these frameworks slowly developing, getting established and maturing. And once we see something that you could call industry best practice, or something that got the nod from regulators, which is ultimately the final confirmation that something works, that's when we'll likely see an explosion in these Gen AI applications going into production. And so I put 6 to 12 months from now. Please don't quote me on that. I have no idea how quickly these things move. It could be 3 months. It could be 2 years. I mean, the last 2 years has really been incredibly crazy in terms of the speed at which things were developing and moving in this space. So, but the expectation, at least from my end, is that this will continue, and the more we can scope the risks and manage the risks, the more this will accelerate, because people will, or organizations will, have the risk appetite to move forward without worrying about the unknown unknowns, so to say. So yeah, it's an incredibly exciting journey, and this is what we're ultimately working on at ValidMind, figuring out where, how we can make a best-in-class governance platform that obviously works incredibly well for any sort of traditional models and machine learning, but also will be able to harness the uncertainties and the risks of Gen AI, which is just this exciting new chapter. So I'll pause there.
That's great. Thanks so much, Kristof. Excellent presentation. And I think, in a lot of our conversations with banks and customers, they're really eager to want to adopt some of these technologies. So one question that came through was just, what advice do you have for banks and financial institutions who are kind of feeling pressure from leadership to start to move faster and implement faster? I mean, you talked about some of the bolder experimentation that's happening, but what advice do you have for banks who are trying to move a little faster in this area?
Again, it's incredibly difficult, because I think while you have the uncertainty of the unknown, it's just, especially for second line teams, it's risky, and also not just second line. I mean, one of the biggest questions here is security, right? Have you been able to really ensure that the data that you put into this will not move into the public space in any way, or will not be compromised somehow? I mean, that is huge for banks. And actually, while I was at JP, that was one of the biggest efforts for sure, to make sure that any sort of confidential data will be safe for the firm. And honestly, for these things, you just need to go through the steps. I think in terms of some of the other risks, when it comes to hallucinations, when it comes to toxicity, there's really, you need to think about the practical ways that manifests in your specific use case, and oftentimes it isn't that big of a deal, right? So for example, when I was dealing with this, I was asking for all sorts of feedback from any test users, and within the organization's use of these models, there really weren't any instances of like toxicity or bias, right? You're ultimately using these tools for business purposes. You're not trying to break the models into giving you something that's inappropriate. So that really didn't seem to be an issue. And you know, while it is a risk, you have to think about how that risk applies to your use case. And the same with hallucinations. Let's say you have hallucinations, but if you're using it as a tool for one of your experts, your experts are ultimately accountable for that work that they're creating with this. It's still going to really increase their efficiency if they're able to create a first draft, or if they're able to summarize some sort of content very quickly, to then be able to dig deeper and confirm. And the same with, I mean, I think a huge low-hanging fruit is really code generation. I mean, getting that first draft of the code done for your application is really incredibly low risk, and should really increase the efficiency of your developers. I mean, all of that code needs to go through the regular testing and security checks and all of that before it's put into production anyway. So you have a robust framework around the productionalization of that anyways. So why not just speed up that grunt work process for your developers?
Very good. Well, thank you so much, Kristof. And thank you for watching, for tuning in, whether you're tuning in on LinkedIn or YouTube. Thanks for being with us today. And if you're interested in learning more about ValidMind, who we are, what we do, please reach out to us, validmind.ai/contact. You can get in touch with us. We'd love to give you a demo, walk you through the ValidMind platform. Thanks again, Kristof. We'll be back with another one of these webinars in a couple of weeks, so please watch this space.